Title: What Patton Said When German Children Begged American Soldiers for Food. Script: May 1945. The sun rises over the Rheingau wine region. In the town of Eltville, a dusty American checkpoint sits at the edge of a cobblestone road. It is a quiet morning. Birds chirp in the vineyards. Corporal Wendell Carter stands watch. A young girl named Lot approaches. She wears braids and a tattered dress. She says nothing. She simply holds out her small, trembling hands. Within minutes, 30 more children gather in the dust. They are starving. Carter reaches for his rations, but his sergeant steps forward with a cold glare. The order is clear: no food for the enemy. The soldiers watch the children, and the children watch the soldiers. It is a standoff of hunger and duty. General George S. Patton is miles away, but his arrival will soon force every man at this checkpoint to choose between the regulations of war and the demands of mercy. This is the story of how a single chocolate bar nearly cost a soldier his career, and how George Patton handled the smallest victims of a fallen empire. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to telling the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. By joining us, you help keep these forgotten moments of history alive for the generations to follow. Corporal Wendell Carter was 24 years old. He came from Springfield, Missouri. He served with the 12th Infantry Regiment. Before the war, he had spent his days hauling lumber at his father's mill. He enlisted 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor because he believed in doing his part. He had spent 8 months in the mud of Europe. He saw his best friend die in a ditch outside St. Lo. He saw things a man from Missouri should never have to see. He carried that grief like a stone in his boot. But the war had not yet turned him into a ghost. He was combat-tested but still human, still capable of pity. He had saved a single Hershey's bar from his ration pack for 3 days. He intended to eat it that evening in the quiet of his foxhole. It was a small piece of home. When he looked at Lotto, the chocolate felt heavy in his pocket. He saw the hunger in her face and knew he could not keep it for himself. Sergeant Earl Rakowski was 36 years old. He was a career soldier from Chicago. He had spent half his life in uniform and knew nothing else. He wore a pair of polished leather boots he had taken from a German warehouse. They were clean. They were expensive. They were the mark of a man who took what he wanted. Rakowski believed the war was simple. He believed feeding German civilians was a direct betrayal of every American soldier buried in the soil of France. He often said that a hungry enemy was a defeated enemy. He lived by the book and expected his men to do the same. He viewed the starving children as a tactical threat rather than a human tragedy. To him, one act of kindness was a crack in the dam. He believed that if you fed one child today, 3,000 would swarm the checkpoint tomorrow. He stood with his jaw set, watching the girl as if she were a scout for an approaching army. May 1945 was a month of hollow silence. The Nazi machine had collapsed into a pile of gray brick and broken glass. Across the Rheingau, the vineyards stood neglected and the cellars were bare. The German government did not exist. There were no shops to buy bread, and no trains to bring grain from the east. The roads were clogged with refugees who had lost everything in the air raids. The American Third Army moved through this wreckage like a giant machine. They had plenty of fuel and bullets, but food was a different matter. Every crate of K rations was counted and logged. General Eisenhower had issued strict orders against fraternization. Soldiers were told not to speak to the local population. They were told not to share their supplies. Many officers followed these rules with a cold heart. They saw the German people only as the enemy who had started the fire. They believed that if the locals were hungry, it was their own fault. In other towns, commanders looked the other way, while their men tossed scraps to the desperate. There was no consistency. There was only the chaos of a continent trying to find its feet after 6 years of slaughter. The military police patrolled the bridges while the children watched from the shadows. The local relief agencies had no resources left to give. In the small town of Eltville, the wine country was a place of ghosts and empty plates. The war was over on paper, but for the civilians on the ground, the struggle for survival was just entering its most desperate hour. The dust on the road outside the checkpoint remained still as the young girl stared at the pocket where the corporal hid his chocolate bar. Lieutenant David Miller was 28 years old. He came from Boston. He served in the same infantry regiment as Carter and Rakowski. He had been a high school history teacher before he wore the uniform. He had lost his younger brother at Anzio. He knew the cost of the war better than most. He walked toward the checkpoint when he heard the shouting. He saw 30 children huddled by the road. He saw Carter standing with empty hands. He saw Rakowski's face turning a deep shade of red. He stepped between the two men. "Sergeant, what is the problem here?" Miller asked. "Carter is violating the non-fraternization order," Rakowski said. "He gave a girl a piece of candy," Miller replied. "He gave a piece of candy to a kraut," Rakowski spat. "She's a child, Sergeant. She's a mouth to feed that we didn't budget for. It came from his own rations. It doesn't matter whose ration it was. The war is over, Rakowski. The war isn't over as long as these people are still breathing our air. That is enough. Calm down." "I won't calm down while my men act like charities. It was one chocolate bar. Bar leads to 100. We have crates of food in the truck. That food is for soldiers. Only soldiers. Soldiers eat first. Civilians eat never. You are speaking about 7-year-olds. I'm speaking about the enemy. They are all the same. I am ordering you to return to your post. I'm filing a report. Carter needs to be broken for this. You want to court-martial a man for being kind? I want to court-martial a man for treason. Treason is a heavy word, Sergeant. Helping the enemy is the definition of the word. They are starving children, not an army. Hunger is a weapon. We should use it. You really believe that? I believe every calorie they eat is a calorie stolen from a dead American. You think starving kids wins wars? I think it makes sure they don't start the next one. That's not how we do things. Maybe it's how we should have done them from the start. You're out of line, Sergeant. I'm the only one standing on the line. I'll handle the report myself, Rakowski. Make sure you tell them I'm the one who caught him. I'll tell them everything you said. Good. Maybe some officer in headquarters still has a spine. I doubt you'll like the result. I like the truth. These people deserve to crawl. They are human beings. They are Nazis in smaller uniforms. The girl is 7. She'll be 17 soon enough. Let her learn what defeat tastes like. Go back to your jeep, Rakowski. I'm doing my duty. You should try it." Miller looked at the children. He saw the gap between a soldier and a tyrant. He turned his back on the sergeant. He walked to his jeep and grabbed his radio. He knew someone was in the sector. He knew someone who didn't like middle ground. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate. 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. He stepped out and straightened his jacket. He did not shout. He did not even raise his hand. He simply stood in the dust and looked. The checkpoint went silent. Every soldier felt the weight of those 4 stars. Patton walked toward Sergeant Rakowski. He stopped 3 feet away. "Sergeant, did you report a violation of orders at this post?" Patton asked. "Yes, General. Corporal Carter, sir." "And what was the nature of this violation?" "He distributed American rations to German civilians, sir. To these children." "Yes, sir. He gave away a chocolate bar." "And why did you feel this required a court-martial?" "It's a betrayal of our mission, sir. Feeding them is helping the enemy." Patton looked at the horizon for a long moment. Then he spoke. "You say feeding children is a betrayal, Sergeant. You say a piece of chocolate is a weapon in the hands of the enemy. You believe that a hungry child makes a safer neighbor. An army moves on its stomach. You think that applies to a nation as well. You believe if we feed them, they remain strong enough to hate us. You believe if we starve them, they learn the price of their arrogance. That is what you told your lieutenant. But you are wrong. A soldier fights men with rifles. A soldier does not fight girls with braids. You see a Nazi in a 7-year-old. I see a girl whose father is dead and whose house is gone. I see a girl who is hungry. Corporal Carter from Missouri saw that child. He gave up his own comfort. He gave up his only piece of home to ease the suffering of a victim. That is not treason. That is the behavior of a man who remembers why he is here. We are here to destroy a regime, not a race. We are here to rebuild a world that the madmen broke. If we act like the animals we just defeated, then the millions of rounds we fired were a waste of lead and a waste of lives. You stand there in polished boots while these children have no shoes. You think your rank gives you the right to be cruel. It does not. It gives you the responsibility to be just. You have a choice. You can stay at this post and watch me promote the man you tried to ruin, or you can accept a transfer to a labor battalion today. You will spend your days digging graves for the men you claim to honor. Decide now." Patton reached into his own uniform pocket. He pulled out a bar of chocolate and handed it directly to Lade. The girl took it with wide eyes as the general turned his gaze toward Wendell Carter. Patton announced that as of that moment, Carter was no longer a corporal. He was a sergeant. He ordered Carter to take immediate command of civilian relief for the entire sector. Within 2 hours, 2 field kitchens pulled into the checkpoint. The air of Eltville was soon thick with the smell of hot beef soup and fresh bread. Large metal canisters of milk were uncapped for the youngest children. Carter stood at the head of the line, ladling hearty stew into mismatched bowls held by small, trembling hands. Rakowski stood frozen by his jeep, forced to watch the very act of charity he had called a betrayal. He saw the steam rising in the cool morning air. He heard the sound of children eating for the first time in days. He smelled the yeast of the bread. The townspeople watched from their windows as the American army turned its focus from war to survival. Patton watched the first few children eat before climbing back into his jeep. He left the new sergeant to feed the town. Wendell Carter returned to Springfield, Missouri in late 1945. He married his sweetheart and took over his father's lumber mill. He was a quiet man who worked hard and spoke little. He kept a small frame on his office wall for 50 years. Inside was a charcoal drawing of a flower on a scrap of newspaper. It was a gift from Latte. He died in 1996 at the age of 75. He never saw Eltville again. He kept that drawing as a reminder that a single act of kindness can outlast a war. He lived to see his own grandchildren grow up in a world without hunger. Earl Rakowski left the service in 1947. He struggled with the transition to civilian life. He worked as a security guard in Chicago and lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment. He was a bitter man who felt the army had betrayed his loyalty. He never understood why his hardness was seen as a flaw rather than a virtue. He died in 1982. He left behind no family and few friends. He remained a soldier of the old world until his final breath. He never accepted the change that Patton had forced upon him that morning in the dust. General Patton mentioned the encounter only once in a letter to his wife. He wrote that a soldier who cannot feel for a child is a soldier who has lost his soul. He kept Carter's report in his desk until his final day in Germany. He believed the corporal had shown more courage in that checkpoint than many men did in the heat of battle. He often said that the ultimate goal of war is to create a peace worth living in. He knew that the candy bar in the girl's hand was a better victory than any flag on a pole. Some historians argue that Patton's decision in Eltville was a breach of military discipline that undermined the non-fraternization orders designed to keep the occupation force secure. They suggest that such acts of mercy could have disrupted the military supply chain and created an unsustainable reliance on American rations. Others argue that this moment represented a vital shift from combat to reconstruction, proving that the occupation would be defined by feeding the hungry, rather than punishing the weak. What is certain is that the feeding stations established at that checkpoint became the blueprint for local relief efforts throughout the Rheingau, marking the day the army stopped moving tanks and started delivering bread. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have followed the strict military orders to ignore the civilians? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe to the channel today.